Welcome back to Ask a Creationist. I'm Todd Wood. I'm president of Core Academy of Science, and I'm a young age creationist. I'm here to answer your questions about science, faith, evolution, creation, origins, the Bible, whatever you got. We're interested in hearing from you. If you have a question that's always been bugging you, why don't you send it to us, and we'll see if we can find an answer for you. Maybe we'll feature it on a future episode of Ask a Creationist. This episode, we're going to consider a very important question. Why does creation matter? Good question. Get this a lot, right? You have this whole ministry dedicated to this creation question. Why does this matter? What's the big deal? Why are you so worked up about this? And there are answers. There are lots of answers. Every creationist ministry will give you pretty good answers that relate creation to other subjects, theological subjects that we're very interested in. Things like marriage. Jesus quotes Genesis to justify marriage. Peter cites the flood to explain the second coming of Christ. And Paul explains Christ's death and resurrection as a remedy for Adam's sin. So there are these places in the New Testament which clearly are interacting with the creation accounts in the Old Testament, be they the actual creation account itself, or the fall, or the flood, or maybe even the Tower of Babel. And in those intersection points, there's something important about reading those first 11 chapters of Genesis well and reading them correctly in order to understand how the rest of the story of redemption and salvation actually work. And I don't disagree. That's correct. I think there's a little more, and that's kind of what I want to explore here in this episode. And it all kind of relates to the original question. And I'd like to know, why does it matter, right? It can connect to theology, that's true, but we've got a lot of creative theologians out there who like to sort of reimagine how theology might work, and, they can come up with all sorts of crazy things. So why does it matter, right? And part of that, I think, comes back to the question of what does it mean for something to matter? And is it okay for us to just monkey around with theology and change it into something that maybe wasn't before in order to just accommodate, whatever evolutionary idea comes along? But what does it mean for something to matter? Now, some folks will tell us, and I hear this all the time, there's sort of this issue in theology whenever there's a big argument and people just don't want to concede they're wrong, they will just say, well, it's a secondary matter, right? Implying that the world exists of this simple binary classification of things that matter and things that don't matter, right? And so whatever I think is really important goes in the things that matter category, and the things that you disagree with me about, that goes in the things that don't matter category. And so it's real easy. And so you sort of get the brush off. It's kind of like getting the theological brush off. Well, you've got to understand, this is a secondary matter. And I don't see it like that. Other people have a much more relativistic view. They would argue that it's all just shades of gray. So the only real question that matters at all is, what does it matter to you? How does it impact you personally? Is it important to you personally? Then it's important. If it's not important to you personally, then it's not important. But ultimately, it's all just a matter of personal preference, because there is no, firm right or wrong on these matters. So it's all just shades of gray. And I think that's incorrect as well. I don't think that theology is just a matter of what fits with me as if it was some sort of big smorgasbord, and it, so long as I got my calories in for the day, it really doesn't matter if I go for the lobster or if I go for the steak or if I go for the corn on the cob. It's irrelevant. I don't think that's true. I think there are real rights and wrongs. I think there are things that are really important. And I don't think that we can just sort of shrug everything off that we don't like and say that's just a secondary matter that we're free to disagree on. Sometimes things are really important, but maybe they're not, salvation, going to hell kind of important. Maybe they're close to that. Maybe they're, down the list from that, but they're not unimportant. Now, what's interesting about this, I think Jesus gives us a pretty clear way of sorting through some of these questions. And one of the things that Jesus said, how do you know what in life is going to matter? Well, the Great Commandment, right? The lawyers and the scribes asked him, what do you think the greatest commandment is? This was, sort of a common little argument that they could have. And Jesus was quick to respond. It's love the Lord your God. This is the great and first commandment. That's the most important thing. And it's not the only. Again, don't make this out to be I'm some kind of liberal who just thinks we ought to love each other and get along. Stop doing that. Stop thinking that way. And recognize that this is what Jesus said. Jesus really did say the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God. And it's impossible for me to imagine then God taking the time to craft this creation in a way that he explicitly says reflects his glory, right? This isn't just a random world with a bunch of random things. Oh, I think I'll put a green thing over here and a blue thing over there. God has a very clear plan in mind that the world would point the way back to him, that the world would bring him glory, and the world would reflect his character. So in doing that, it is a gift to us that functions as a reflection of him. How can this not matter? Right? If a scientist comes along and says, this is how the world works, this is the way your cells function. There are things such as cells. That matters because it's God's work that he's talking about. And maybe it's not God's word. No, it's not God's word, but it is still God's work. It is still a thing that God has done, a thing that God has given us. And we ought to care about it for no other reason than that. It's God's. And it shows us things about who God is. And for us to say, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter what the answer to this real weird question is. We won't ever know. Blah, blah, blah. I'm just fatalistic. Wrong. It matters. It might not be your passion or calling in life, but the church ought to care. The church collectively ought to care. And Jesus also said there's a second great commandment, the second most important, and that is to love your neighbor as yourself. And again, I want to emphasize this is not the only commandment, and that loving your neighbor does not mean always affirming everything that they do or accepting them just as they are, whatever liberal distortion of this command you might be thinking of. But it doesn't change the fact that just because it gets distorted, that it isn't the second great commandment. So in what way then can we say, how do we love our neighbor through understanding God's creation? And I think at least two things that come to my mind as I think about this. One thing is that as creation declares God's glory and draws us closer to the Creator, we ought to be bringing others on that journey with us. Sometimes that means the message of salvation needs to be brought together with what God has made to bring people to a knowledge of the Creator. And in other cases, it might be that we need to focus on discipleship and teaching people about the wonders of God's creation so that they can appreciate better the God who sent his Son to save us. That seems really exciting and important to me. Creation ought to matter even to the second commandment. And then the second thing that comes to mind is that this is our home and this is our neighbor's home. And we should care about that. We should care about taking care of our homes. We have to live here. If someone came onto your property or came into your house or apartment and trashed it, you would be pretty annoyed. That would not be a loving thing to do for your neighbor to do to you, right? And so I think we do, just from the notion of loving our neighbor. We have a responsibility to treat this creation well. And knowing how to treat it well means that we need to understand what it is, how it works, and maybe even sometimes where it came from. And all of those things should factor into managing creation well, in the image of God, practicing good, godly dominion over creation. So that's another reason I think that creation has every impact on the way we ought to think about loving God and loving our neighbor, obeying those two great commandments. So thinking about this question, I get it a lot. Man, I get it a lot. Why does this all matter? What does it matter if the earth is 5 billion years old or 5,000 years old? What does it matter? Well, I always want to respond to, how can it not matter? How can God's given us such a beautiful thing? How could it not matter? Maybe not every detail is equally important. That's true. But if someone's trying to tell me that it's billions of years old versus thousands of years old, that seems like a really big difference. I ought to be thinking about that and thinking about what that means. And it seems like that ought to matter. And again, I want to emphasize that might not matter that much to you personally. Maybe this isn't your calling. Maybe this isn't your passion in the Lord. And I don't have a problem with that. But if you're going to just selfishly project that lack of calling onto the rest of the church and say it should not matter to you either, no, I don't accept that. God's creation matters. It just does, because God made it. All right, well, thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please check us out at coursesci.org/connect. You'll find links there to important content that we would like you to check out. Also, links to our social media accounts. If you're really interested in what I'm doing, you can also check out my Patreon. I am on Patreon now at Research Reports, where you will get semi-regular updates from me about what I've been doing and what I've been working on. Lots of human origin stuff, lots of paleoanthropology stuff, lots of history stuff. These are kind of technical, so maybe it's not for you, but if you're really looking to go deeper, then maybe you should check that out. Do consider a donation to Core Academy. Core Academy is largely a donor-driven ministry, and we rely on the kindness and generosity of our many supporters. If you're already a supporter, thank you so much. If you're not, please consider becoming one if you've enjoyed this series. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.